This is Jimmy. He is walking down a metaphorical pathway, the path to employment. On the path, he comes across a small roadblock. While not convenient, Jimmy has little trouble overcoming it. As Jimmy continues onwards, another obstacle blocks his path. This time, however, it's much more of a barrier than a roadblock, and is something that Jimmy cannot hope to overcome. Barriers like these come from a simple diagnosis: autism spectrum disorder. This is Jacob. He is walking down his own metaphorical pathway to employment. Like Jimmy, he encounters roadblocks, and even some tall barriers which are difficult to overcome. Unlike Jimmy, however, Jacob is a neurotypical individual, one without any kind of autism. Unfortunately for Jimmy, he must face the same type of barriers as Jacob, as well as additional barriers because of his diagnosis.
So autism spectrum disorder is what we call a neurodevelopmental disorder, meaning it was present from birth and kind of goes on.
According to a study from the Journal of American Academy for Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, 98.6% of adults have had at least one job in their first 6 years. After high school, in comparison, a staggeringly low 55% of adults with ASD could say the same. Unemployment rates for people with ASD are not only lower than the national average, but significantly lower than adults with mental retardation, learning disabilities, and speech impairments. To understand the reasons for these shocking numbers, you must first understand the nature of ASD.
Very often people's perceptions of autism come from television or movies like Rain Man or 60 Seconds public service announcements, and that's not really a good way of learning about us as a community and as people.
So there are three main pieces to autism spectrum disorder. One is a deficit in what we call social emotional reciprocity. There's also deficits in non-communicative behaviors. Then there's a whole separate section known as restrictive or repetitive patterns of behavior.
Several studies have identified areas that make employment more difficult for people with ASD. A study from Muller et al. Found that adults with ASD had trouble with knowing how to locate a job, initiating job contact, and following up once contacted. For most of America's history, discrimination against people with autism was both legal and widespread. Many businesses would refuse to employ people who are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. The Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA for short, changed that. Employers can no longer legally discriminate against people with autism in terms of hiring practices. One would expect that this would drastically impact the unemployment rate of people with autism, but intuition isn't always correct.
The ADA was passed over 30 years ago, and if you look at the employment rates of adults with autism, and in fact adults with other developmental differences, it really hasn't changed much in the past 30 plus years.
A natural thought one might have at this point is that maybe people with autism don't have jobs just because they don't want to have them. But this is far from the case. According to recent unemployment statistics, around 85% of adults with autism are unemployed. Of them, nearly 70% of these individuals want to work. So how might the government address these issues? Well, government action alone won't be enough to solve the problem. There's still not nearly enough government commitment and action towards solving the issue.
The local, state, and even the federal government needs to do a lot more in the sense that they constantly tell private employers to hire, but they themselves, even though on paper, they all have targeted hiring. In practice, again, the numbers are very modest.
The government should set an example for private employers of open and inclusive workplaces with employment opportunities for people with autism. If the public sector employment isn't inclusive, why would private sector employment be? While the government has given words stating their desire to include individuals with autism, their numbers remain startlingly low, and details of implementation strategies have yet to be made. Additionally, much of the funding the federal government provides goes to organizations like Autism Speaks, which has many issues.
Its research agenda in 2010, the most recent year for which we have analysis, had approximately only 1% of its research budget going towards services issues, and even less than 1% going towards adult issues.
There is also one sector of employment completely excluded from the requirements of the ADA, which is the military. If Jimmy wants to serve for his country in the US military, he faces not only the increased barriers that Jacob does, such as physical fitness, Jimmy also faces direct employment discrimination from the military.
The guidance that we have right now is any measurable level of autism that goes on the spectrum is a disqualifying factor.
While it is possible to get a medical waiver that allows for qualification, it's a difficult process that requires extra steps, and the likelihood of getting a medical waiver varies with each branch. It's more likely that a medical waiver will be approved for the Army and the Navy than in comparison to the Marines and the National Guard. The discriminatory practices of the U.S. military are only a part of a larger issue. Even now, 3 decades after the passing of the ADA, people diagnosed with ASD still face significantly lower rates of employment in all job sectors. The federal government has focused on funding research on ASD instead of supporting the millions of people already diagnosed with it, and stopping inequalities just caused by a simple 3-letter diagnosis.